This is going to be a rough thought catalog and to-do list. So there are three sets of ideas. The first set is a personal psychology cognition that I had that metatype 13, perhaps the best thematic way to describe them would be in their arbitration over gratitude, in restricting gratitude particularly. And so because they think about things from the contemplative point of view of being able to conceptually contract gratitude, that they can kind of shape a field of right and wrong, and sort of like a chessboard to some degree, in which people aren't independent actors because they're not independent, that they all conform to the same metric, to the same grid of a kind of objective, well, it's not really an objective sense of gratitude, but it's a subjectively contended interpretation of a consistent medium of gratitude, which they can subjectively interpolate a contraction thereto. And so they have a kind of an aura or an atmosphere, an intellectual one, of an intellectual contemplative manner that kind of systematizes reality to some degree. And so it is a kind of cobweb of allegiance and loyalties, and at least consortiums of people that agree and disagree. So it's almost like the kind of the liberal field of freedom of association, but applied on a kind of on a reality basis that is fundamentally woven to this aspect of gratitude, which I would also, because I mean, the reason why it's called a metatype 13 is because the center of the false ego complex centers around the 13th dimension of psychological reality, which is the one that I associate with faith, or I call that the 13th dimension is the highest dimension of introverted intuition. And my one word summary of the 13th dimension, of the cognitive function that represents the 13th dimension, is faith. And so that faith essentially is, I must link it to, I must look at the elements of the dimensions and see if that clears itself out. Okay, then I also think that perhaps the 17 dimension model itself is probably related to the tone scale in Scientology, because I think the tone scale also has 17 things in it. So that might be an interesting overlay to look at, because it makes sense that any issue conceptually, or any expression of responsibility or self-determinism, because it's being measured against, let's just say, the vital force of motivation or intentionality, or the inflection of tone in terms of affinity, will have to conceptually manifest via that medium, because the 17 dimensions are inextricably woven and layered upon one each other, that they proceed one from another in quite an organic way. So that might be the base model of the tone scale, or this might be the delineated sort of anatomy of the tone scale. And so that might, and then that finally breathes in some new insight, that, because I mean, in some sense, I had always had trouble rooting a lot of my theory, because I have kind of focusing so much on the false ego complex that I've kind of forgotten the baseline of vitality that perhaps it's meant to help precipitate some kind of self-actualization back to, but I had sort of lost sight of of let's say the trying to, and I think that my general problem, which is perhaps a thematic problem that metatype 13s have, in some sense, because a metatype 13, their trial, the level of psychological reality that corresponds to their trial, is dimension 15, and the trial is the chronic perception of the ego. So it's the thing that you're most imprinted by and conditioned in terms of the most conscious part of your false ego complex. So, and the 15th dimension is the dimension which is so ethereal that they stop getting one-word names and they have to start taking on roles. So the 15th dimension I've always corresponded with, I've always just called it the evangelist. Well, actually the other word is exuberance. And so, but it's a very intellectual form of exuberance because it's actually what symbolizes Malkuth, or earth, in the excuse me, in the tree of life in Kabbalah. But anyway, the kingdoms, right? Malkuth, the kingdom is 15, and I think that in some sense that has represented the sticking point of my psychology, in some sense, that being able to know what things are, what is it at its base, that being made the trial keeps the, I think, I mean, I've said this before when thinking about, for years even, I have been trying to process out the sin and the lust and the death. And I've actually been focusing more on the death and the lust than anything else. I've just been trying to understand things from the perspective of the death and the lust, which is essentially the inner child, the unconscious side of the mind. And also what exists underneath that, because there are more layers of complexity in terms of that ensconces the seed of the death that grows into the false ego complex. But the unconscious sides they have to be understood. But the thing that actually sort of pins the false ego complex in a continuance of operation is the conscious aspects of it. In some sense, it's weird. I mean, you have to fight a battle on two fronts, and you can never complete the one. You can never complete the war until you do. It's weird. It's a paradox, because you have to defeat the one before you defeat the other, and then you have to defeat the other before you defeat the one, and so. And it's impossible to do it simultaneously, but you somehow have to defeat the one before the other, and then the other before the one. So it's like it's a fundamental paradox that in psychology they've always had this problem where they end up with a kind of dilemma where they tackle one issue which they think is definitely primordial and is thematically manifesting itself at multiple levels, and they think that they found something on the deepest level, but whenever they try to tackle it, then it kind of recharges the other issue, and so as soon as they've switched focus, the other one becomes the complaint. And this has led people to try to create theories about which one should take precedence, which one is the sympathetic problem and which one is the primary problem. And all of these things are somewhat irrelevant, because in some sense the one is ontologically prior and the other one is epistemically prior. because there was a false ego complex that was generated, and that had its own game that it was playing, and therefore it had its own truth, and therefore it actually had a different perspective. So you're dealing with two entities, you're dealing with two beings in some sense, and the one being will say always, oh no, deal with the other. Okay, but so you've got these two command outposts within the contemplative realm, and they're sort of bouncing between each other. Anyway, the thing, and okay, so anyway, and I had focused on the unconscious side of the mind because it is the most remote, because it's fundamentally the furthest thing from you, and so that takes the most work, and you really have to focus in on it, because from that perspective, from the unconscious mind's perspective, from the inner child's perspective, so much has gone discombobulated. It's become fragmented, and because the conscious side of the mind has taken such precedence, and it has done things to the subconscious, and the subconscious then basically exists to continually thwart the recoalescence of the inner child. So the inner child has become fragmented by the ego, and it's painstaking to put the inner child back together in order to repiece the primal hurt, as it were, or the origin story from the ontological perspective. And you do need the ontological insight, because otherwise, when you try to, let's say, fix the epistemic problem, which belongs to the epistemic issue is the conscious issue, and the ontological issue is the inner child issue. And you have to marry both of those. You have to solve both. You have to solve for both. And anyway, let me just say that, let me just finish that other thought before I go back to talking about general therapy and general treatment. So the biggest thing that I think was a problem for me, in a thematic sense, in terms of the problem with my false ego, was that exuberance is what is fundamentally the false ego complex of a metatype 13 is fundamentally using the fabric of the 15th dimension of psychological reality as the it's kept nebulous. So the trial is fundamentally kept insoluble. It's kept vague, it's kept murky. It cannot coalesce solidity. It cannot coalesce a stable, solid reality that then you can track and that you can maneuver around or whatever. And that just so happens to fall on dimension 15 for a metatype 13, which means that metatype 15s have what's the word? What's the word that means that, like, it was a good spatial metaphor, but anyway, I guess I'm just going to say deranged. They have, no, but it's not just deranged, it's dispersed. They have a dispersed exuberance. And so their exuberance is they go looking for it. They are tried by it. They are judged for not having it or having it. It's a big question. It's a big concern. It's a quandary on that concept, on the concept of what is it, what it is. So, like the pure essence of what things are at their fundamental, the so it actually misses out on solidity on the very thing that grounds the notion of qualia itself in some sense. So and that having qualia be a fundamental quandary is what, I mean, my particular species of metatype 13 is has the worried tone in it. It has anger, or the angry tone, and it has angry, worried, elated, angry, worried, elated, and there's one more. And it's complicated as well because it's a double circuit, which means that that means that some of these are alternate circuits. So I haven't looked at circuit composition for a long time. It'd be interesting to look at it now, having this other insight. I might be able to interpret a better coalesced narrative and story about how this functions. But yeah, so in some sense, things have always been very opaque to me in terms of, because of just not having this fundamental doubt about what things are, and in some sense, this sounds so vague, but I mean that in that the fun, it's a very abstract kind of thing, because in some sense, not knowing about what things are is a very, it's not as intellectual as it sounds. It actually represents the cognitive function of introverted sensing. Um, but it's a form of introverted sensing which is very similar to introverted thinking. It's a more yeah, I mean, conceptually, many people that are familiar with introverted thinking might disguise, might confuse the two, but the general notion of introverted sensing doesn't do this form of introverted sensing justice. This form of introverted sensing is highly intellectual, because it grounds things in their in a fundamental sense, and then you've got stable entities and particles that you can correlate and relay and juxtapose or contrast in fields of things. And so, I mean, that's why, the evangelist is a very good sort of thing, because in some sense as well, like what things are have to be ensconced in, what's the 14th dimension? Is ti is the word. Um, and that leads up to the 16th dimension. Oh, you see, these things are so esoteric, which is a form of introverted feeling. So it's like the segue between an introverted thinking and an introverted feeling. Um, but okay, wait, no, let me just make my point quickly. So this introverted sensing, like I was just about to almost dismiss it by saying, you can almost live without it to some degree, because it's a very personal kind of relatableness to things. It's a personal kind of association, but not, that sounds like the crude version of introverted sensing. It's the idea that you've captured the totality of significance in the properties of delineation of an object. So in some sense, not having this kind of SI means that you're not even sure that you're contacting the thing itself. That there's a fundamental skepticism, almost like a kind of, almost on the level of Descartes' demon in some sense. Is like is the kind of skepticism that is the lack of this kind of SI. It's that that's personable subjective relatedness to essence, to have the confidence that one has the purview on fundamental essence and qualia that make up what things are. So it's the contact. It's the subjective contact, the immediate knowledge of contact with what things are. That's why I call it exuberance. But it's a conceptual thing in some sense, but it's, well, it's hard to come up with words. It's subjective, but it's also conceptual as its primary thing. So now I'm starting. Maybe that sounds like some version of SI. There are other versions of SI. You see, my system has 17 cognitive functions, but they're only 8. But so essentially, there's more than one type of introverted sensing in my system. So okay, um, yeah, what people would commonly think of as SI would be the fourth dimensional SI. But when you start getting into higher dimensions, things get much more esoteric. So I mean, this is like a subcomponent of faith. This is because every dimension above something is inclusive in the lower, but in a more opaque or obtuse form. So everything above is represented below, but with less delineation. Um, the lower supports the lower is the support structure that allows the higher dimensions to have a more a more particularized specialization and vantage point. It has so it's almost like a step ladder, and so you can see things from different heights. You can make out different details, and so right at the top it connects with the center of everything. So the 17th dimension is the center of the pyramid, is the pinnacle that represents the center of the base as well. So it kind of encapsulates the base, and that's how the top connects with the bottom. Um, there's also an optical kind of way of which is to me it's quite mystical, because I believe the brain actually does function like this, in terms of when you see a shape, when you see a triangle, for instance, when you look at a triangle and you look at the pinnacle, uh, you also see the bottom line, and if you look at the bottom, you also see the pinnacle. It's like the second. It's like it always becomes the natural secondary focus. It becomes the natural secondary point of contact, that you're almost subconsciously aware of the juxtaposition. So if you're intently focused on the point, you are you cannot not sort of be impressed upon by the base of the triangle. And if you're focused on the base, you cannot help but be impressed upon by the pinnacle of the triangle. It's just a almost like a psychological um, wiring, sort of thing that the one implies the other. But I mean, that also has, because people are looking for outline, people are looking in terms of intuiting shape, and it's part of the definitional element of a triangle anyway. So if you're saying, oh, I am looking at a pyramid, because you conceptually that's what a pyramid is. It has a point and it has a base. But if you look at the base, I'm probably not describing it that well in terms of the secondary impression that becomes it becomes a secondary point of immediate awareness. You cannot not be aware of the point when you're aware of the base, um, unless you don't know that you're looking at a pyramid. Uh, Perhaps that's the premise in that psychological trick. But anyway, I mean, it's not a very profound sort of trick, but anyway. Okay, wait. Did I say everything I wanted to say? So, what things are? So, okay, so my personal point about this is, so having the confidence to make contact with a certainty about what things are. Yeah, and that becomes dispersed and deranged in order to sustain the false ego complex. So actually, perhaps the focal point of treatment for therapy of a metatype is to actually allow people to coalesce or revitalize the trial dimension. Because without the trial, you don't have to worry about the sin, because the sin only comes from essentially the non-execution of, I mean, essentially you endure the trial for so long until until you wish to escape, until you wish to almost essentially, you wish whatever cycle of action that you're engaged in, you wanted to commit suicide. You wanted to die and start again. And as soon as you have that wish for death, then the sin emerges, because then the wish to start again, the wish to die and be reborn in that sense, is you have to commit yourself to having done something so that you can start a new cycle of action, because you have to leave the old cycle somehow, and you can only do that once you've committed yourself to having done something. And that is what the sin is that you have to, you have to be cognizant that you have failed to do something. You have to tell yourself, okay, I failed. You have to tell yourself, my will was not executed. I did something, and I did what I didn't want to do, and I did what I didn't initially choose to do. So I sacrifice my word, I sacrifice my will. So you concede to death, and you accept the death, and you embrace the death, and that is how essentially you become a slave to death. Because you cannot essentially find the magic of being able to forgive yourself, let's just say, to say, okay, well, the cycle of action was actually fundamentally toxic, and I don't want to continually recur into trying to push myself to find a way to be right and to reclaim the prior deaths. I just want to actually be reborn as a new being, or something like that. So or I mean, that's one way to do it. I mean, you don't have to do it. I mean, in some sense, that would be in a behavioral sense, in a behavioral metaphorical sense. That is what you have to do in order to escape. But in terms of how you actually activate it cognitively, I mean, there are many clouds to find the truth in. There are many clouds to see the new beingness. There are many mysteries that can reveal the solution to this problem. That is what it means when it says that Jesus is coming on a cloud in the scriptures. It's you have to know what the Son of Man is. When the Son of Man is coming on a cloud, the Son of the Man is the new generation from the man. You see, the scriptural language is very. I mean, the reason why I said Jesus is because Jesus, you have to know this, but Jesus actually means something particular. Jesus is not a person. Jesus is a spiritual name, and he chose that name because it's part of the doctrine that you have to understand to make any of it work. Jesus literally means Jehovah saves the anointed of God. Again, Jehovah is the tetragrammaton. I am that I am. So Jesus literally means I am that I am saves the anointed of God. So it just means that you have to be anointed of God. That's all you need, is you need the anointment. And or what is it to be anointed of God? Well, you have to be the Son of God. Well, I mean, if you take the rest of the, I mean, okay, that I skipped a few steps. But that's the end of that of that. But essentially, because you have to understand that the message of yeah, okay, the slight elaboration is that you have to understand that Jesus Christ came to teach us an understanding, to live in him that is true, in his Son, Jesus Christ. And that is fundamentally You have to basically, the core of the doctrine is Christ consciousness. So it's very clear that it's not beloved. Try the spirits. For many false prophets are gone out unto the world, and hereby ye know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. All those who confesseth that Jesus is come in the flesh is of God, and all those who confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. And here is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. So in 1 John chapter 4, it is literally saying that if you don't confess that Jesus Christ is in the flesh, you are not of God. It doesn't say that you must confess that Jesus Christ did come in the flesh. It's not past tense. You have to read the King James Version, not the corrupted interpretations. That all those who confess that Jesus Christ is not come, that's a negative. Not come is a negative, that he hasn't come, but it says is not. Is present is present tense. That's not a past participle. Is not come. And then it says in the affirmative that all those who confess that he is come. Now, you cannot confess something that you believe secondhand. Confession literally means, in the English language, it means personal knowledge, direct knowledge. You cannot confess something that you have not witnessed yourself. You can't get someone to confess on the stand something and then say, okay, well, now you've just confessed this and you've told us this, but you didn't see it yourself. Then how are you confessing it? It's not possible. Confession requires direct, immediate witness. So if you didn't live 2,000 years ago, then, if that's your interpretation of confessing that he did come in the flesh, which is not what 1 John chapter 4 says. It says, all those who confess that Jesus is come in the flesh is of God. The only way to do that is if it's Christ consciousness, is if you confess that Jesus is come in your flesh. And how does that happen? What is Jesus Christ? Jesus Christ is in 1 John chapter 5 is very clear. It's an understanding. It's anyway, okay, I'm going into all this stuff. But this is the core of the faith. This is the core of the doctrine, and it's this whole point is anyway. I mean, again, like, if you once you decode the scripture, I mean, you can turn it into a secular philosophy very easily. But it's very important, I think, to have the metaphor, because otherwise it's very hard to conceptually understand it. It's very hard to come to an understanding of something that's so complicated unless you have a mystery. Because if you don't have a mystery, there's no way to learn something that is so complicated that you can't learn in one sitting. Because people can't absorb information for 60 hours of talking about philosophy and then join all the dots at the end. You have to be able to join the dots before the whole thing is worked out. So that is the function of mystery, which is a fundamental. A mystery is a fundamental confusion, and it's working out the mystery. It says in Revelation, and the mystery of God shall be finished. Anyway, but I mean, yeah, there are secular ways of getting to the same sort of psychological thing, the same psychological understanding. Spirit, psyche, they have the same, they are the same root Greek base. Anyway, so there was a huge sidetrack. So anyway, the function of this is in some sense, and the question, what is God? Well, in a kind of archetypal sense, right? In a pure sort of secular way, God is the source of life, and also has a kind of uh, I don't want to use the word authority. I'm just trying to think of what to conceptually connect it to. So I guess the only way to sort of countenance it is to say that, like, God has the responsibility to provide authority and cohesion, but that perhaps is a bit too anthropomorphized. I guess, the confusion is that that there are three parts to God, um, and in a much broader sense, there are also five parts, and then there are also six parts, um, and that five and that six has the difference between the five model and the six model is has to be seen jointly together, and it's an asymmetry that is embedded within the 17 dimensions that itself is adds to a very complicated array of metaphysics and grammar that is woven into the structure of consciousness itself. Um, because in some sense it is the central pillars of grammar uh, that allow grammar to be parsed, parsed, um, and in certain combinations, and certain partial combinations, you get very interesting dimensions of understanding the or dynamics of understanding how things are systematized in some sense, in a metaphysical sense, and then combined in its totality in terms of just the God aspects. You see the central role that certain prime features are are stably represented in relation to those prime core tenants. So it's like the tenants themselves are tenants because they are tenants to one another, and so they kind of create a stable. And then in totality, you can see that those features produced by that trinity of tenants um, has a certain special relationship to thought itself, to thinking, to the understanding. They have a certain pervasive, absolute reach, and that they are both the background and the when I say background, I mean like they are both the environment, they are both the backdrop, they are both the medium, but they are also elements of the it's a kind of culture that 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 is its own, I guess you could call it law to some degree, that it is its own self-made law that cannot be broken, that cannot be infringed on without consequence, but that it also that law is fundamentally what was that other aspect that I was just thinking now? That so that in some sense that it is, in some interpretive sense you could call it a naturalistic culture that pervades any responsible economy of purpose, and then so it is a certain requisite set of adherence that must be uncovered and exalted in order to unlock an actualization of sophistication or articulation of a full range of or at least also to unlock the height of dynamism within a kind of an economy of purpose. So in some sense it's an unlocking of higher states of functioning, and I'm just trying to piece how this goes together with the evangelists. So the evangelist is sort of in a kind of in a pristine form of a stable evangelist in terms of the concept of the mind itself and stabilizing it, is familiar enough with these fundamental elements in order to even preemptively be able to diagnose. Fatalistic recurring drama and the endless monotony and the wandering and the listlessness, which characterizes those who have not actually discovered how to actualize a fruitful economy of purpose, that they are fundamentally like the sea. They just have troughs and crests, uh, uh, peaks and troughs, and they even themselves out in their chaos. Because they do not, there's a lot of commotion, there's a lot of turbulence. It's conducting a lot of different current that is turbulently resolving itself endlessly, and it's essentially just thrown around by celestial conditioning, by being impinged on by its framing environment in some sense. it's just a kind of, it's a confusion of other forces that are merely just transmitting the kind of environmental conditionality via this medium, which is just soaking up the what's the word that means chaos, entropy. That's sort of it is the sponge of entropy in some sense. So, in some sense, everything is either just an entropy sponge, or it's actually functioning the kingdom, the economy of purpose. Anyway, so this is almost a, and this is the function that the evangelist, this is the spiritual gift of the evangelist. And the kind of certainty that the evangelist has is a completely different form of intellectualism than what is generally respected of in the world. It's not a kind of factual certainty. It's a certainty that's literally constructed from humility. The first spiritual fact that one knows is that you might be wrong. And so what can you do? You can just continue on with open eyes, looking always if there's a better way, looking always if there's something that you've overlooked. Not in a worried way. If you do it in a worried way, if you do it in an overly conciliatory way, that is its own stumbling, that becomes its own drama, that is its own thing that you could find a better solution to, you could find a sharper heuristic to. It's interesting, I should have explored my personal issue more on the theme of contracting gratitude. Because it's not so much, the contraction of gratitude that isn't even the problem. The problem is that the contraction of gratitude happens in an amalgamated way in which gratitude becomes a universal property that is shared collectively by everyone. So there is no more individual independent gratitude. There is only a kind of objective gratitude which is being measured and being arbitrated over by the metatype 13. And that is what is creating a fun, because by creating that metric, by creating that objective measure, it is dissolving the coalescence of the evangelist, the gift of the evangelist, or the proper functioning of metatype, the proper function of dimension 15. Okay, there, I think I just answered the question, so I need to continue to think about that. Okay, then the third idea that I had was it on politics or the media, or lies, or a kind of cultural commentary? What was it? It was another take on problems in culture. It's interesting how it's weird how a society seems to lie to itself about very basic things. How opinions get popular because they're repeated by news people. I guess it's scapegoating. It's just the mimetic stuff. I mean, you would almost make one prone to conspiracy, or just the kind of the mediocrity of the mob justice of the masses. How they will just find convenience and cheap excuses rather than taking on a proactive outlook I mean, generally, thematically, what precipitates all of this and what facilitates all of this, rather, not precipitates, what facilitates all of this is this allergy to accountability of resting with the people. That it's always government's fault. It's not the people's fault for like not holding political parties responsible or not holding particular politicians responsible, but probably parties, because you can always say that, oh, you can always be sold the new person, but if you don't vilify the party, if you don't find a proximate cause that is likely to actually make a difference, if you don't change tact, like I just heard in Colombia that they had one very bad president that was in for 12 years. So they made it so that you can only have a president for one term. So they actually have this horrible political economy where they just keep on getting these puppets that were connected. So now the guy who's the president now, they found out after he was elected, was very close friends in his school days with the president that was there for 12 years. And he's basically just doing everything that it's just a continuation of that guy, essentially. And it's like, well, if that happens, obviously there's no point in blaming the particular politician because he'll never be president again. You have to blame the political party for doing that, for not vetting the person or whatever. And because, I mean, he also, I've heard, he's went back on all of his campaign promises. It's also put at risk the peace process. And the old guy, the old president that was there for 4 years that actually engineered the peace there, he was essentially vilified by I guess corrosion of public support, because I guess maybe the former president that was there for 12 years controlled enough of the media to essentially manufacture sentiment in order and now they have the killings again because they've broken the armistice essentially, or the structure of the peace that was set up by the one good president for 4 years, because he was vilified and they got in a new puppet. So I mean, it's interesting how societies can self-delude. But I mean, I wonder if that's a journalism problem again, if it's just that, this is what happens in societies when journalism is controlled by political cliques, when it's bought by certain forms of capture. Anyway. It's also so depressing when you watch things like CNN, and they don't substantiate their claims. They don't make claims properly. It's disgusting. They use adjectives. They don't make arguments. Or I guess no, they do kind of make a weird kind of partisan argument. But they don't substantiate anything properly. I mean, they don't make, so like they don't treat the audience like they're making a claim that they have to sort of evidence or back up, or kind of give whatever the counter argument is. They make no interest in voicing the other side. They just say that it doesn't exist, and then they excuse their lack of giving the other side because they just use adjectives instead. So they use adjectives to excuse their doubling down of partisan or non-impartial assessment, And I mean, this is why, they've never looked at Sweden. They've never interviewed the scientists around Sweden. They just give these very short summaries about things that are tailor-made, which are descriptive. Like, I guess if you make an adjective, you don't have to be said that you're spreading lies and misinformation because adjectives are subjective. It's like, it's, I guess that's what they're used to with identity politics, because the sacred cow is good enough to generalize for. Yeah, I guess this is what you call a cultural doom spiral. But let me read something just so I have it on voice recording, because I'll probably upload this. I wrote, I think, what a very nice response to someone. Just interrupted. Okay, so let me just read out this. This was a I was perhaps a bit too harsh on this guy. I say that perhaps with good cause, because I didn't properly read everything he had to say. So he wrote this very long. It was on this community where people post their opinions, and it said, so the title of his My Take, which is the take he has on something, is Feminism Mitgau, MGTOW, Men Going Their Own Way, and What I Learned Playing Devil's Advocate in My Take. So he says, for the past year or so, I have engaged in a type of clickbait social experiment of users in the GAG community, the Girls Ask Guys community. The idea was to put forward an outlandish or controversial opinion from both sides of the societal perspective and see how people reacted. What I learned was quite surprising. And then he gives his list of the things that he wrote, which were all kind of inflammatory things. Like the one was the stupidity of the Mitgau movement, why Mitgau is so popular among men. I am a woman, I am the prize. I am a woman, exclamation mark, I am the prize. Redefining our manhood and the defeat of patriarchy. Remember, gentlemen, you are the prize. Why all women are manipulative liars. So those were the things that he wrote, which are, kind of all over the place. And then he says his sort of, he's got these paragraphs with headings. He says, everyone hates you. If I wrote something defending women's rights, everyone would attack me as being a beta male feminist. If I wrote something critical of women, everyone would attack me for being a male misogynist. Absolutism. People are more concerned about being right than exposing the true nature of their feelings. People won't answer the merits of a question, but will say that's not true of all people. That's a pretty bad counterpoint to absolutism. He tries to put out the sort of balance thing, and then he has these other conclusions. He says, women have little courage. Even in my takes that advocate for feminism, women are reluctant to take on gag men in defending and promoting feminism. Men are tired of dating women. So he's just quoting something. He says, 50% of men believe that single mothers are damaged goods and are not worth dating. Many male users express frustration about women using dating apps for attention and games, not real love. And I think he had an editing mistake. Anyway, so I wrote the things that he wrote, which I didn't go into, but anyway. I think, so my response is, and I think this is the reason why I'm reading out this response is because it has a lot of political things in it. I think your social experiment might suffer from a tinge of confirmation bias within the hidden influence of your methodology. The idea that you can test people or a whole community and tender objective judgments about them. Most people with genuine opinions won't waste their energy on rehashed arguments that have an atmosphere of scripted toxicity. The arguments leveraged by critical theory and conflict theory are so poisonous that most sane people wish to limit their exposure to having to engage with their tactics of sweeping generalizations and fighting fire with fire, as identity politics implores people to replicate its thinking in order to better endure the narcissistic culture of superficial accusations that it's accustomed to publicizing and promoting. Some Mitgao are merely trying to defensively reclaim some territory to find a safe seclusion of cultural space, where it's okay to be masculine without the metric of toxic masculinity being leveraged against them. It's a cultural backlash and represents a group of normal people who aren't ideological or intellectual, forced to making arguments that can contend in an arena against identity politics. Some other Midgar men are perfectly reasonable and sane. They are just coping with certain recognitions that they consider it rational to respond to the prevalence of certain of those conditions. I just said prevalence of conditions. Colon, but all interpretation of reality can be used as a source of toxic conceit. How certain is any theory of knowledge, how certain is any theory or knowledge claim? Being open to new ideas and new outlooks is an important aspect of intellectual humility. Sadly, these values are exactly what gets abused by the rise in vulnerable narcissism that is both celebrated and empowered by identity politics. I would say your social experiment is yet further fuel to the fires of inauthenticity, scripted and gamed judgmentalness, which to my mind is psychologically similar to the kind of armchair moral authority that is claimed through mobilization of superficial generalizations. Feminism is dangerous because the conflict theory and critical theory that it's based on is a form of identity nationalism within a transnational worldview. Your identity interest becomes your nation. It's very similar to the fascistic worldview and politics of ethno-nationalism, forcing people to demand security from culture and politicians delivered to the identity generalization. As such, liberal values have been hurt and democracy has been destabilized as the mainstream journalism becomes a mouthpiece for this new version of politics. The world is becoming like a one ideology state under identity politics. I blame academics and journalists for this cultural shift. I hope democracy will return back to health soon, but culture is lagging behind to properly debunk poison like feminism. And then I said, Mitgao is a red herring issue. It's a red herring because it's a secondary symptom. It's a response to the prime culprit. Remove feminism and then afterwards go after and criticize Mitgao until it's unpopular. But in my view, it's a diversionary issue that merely will prolong the cause of this cultural situation, to treat Mitgao like it's its own problem. When within its own thinking, it's considered a response to the prevalence of ideological warfare that continues to rage. And Mitgao is advocating for non-participation. It's not even fighting back against feminism. It's only justifying its own views on how to rationalize its own coping tactics. It's a form of non-participation. It's a form of pacifism in some sense. It's just a form of conscientious pacifism where they're saying why they're not participating. Attacking somebody's reasoning for their own behavior. I mean, it's a personal choice. And in some sense, it should be healthily covered by liberal views. The idea that other people are forced into doing behavior that is prescripted to them by some kind of identity politics authoritarian. It just shows the kind of how the framework has been so obscurely deranged into this new form of this idea of this pervasive collective fabric, which has actually been crafted out of sexual energy and sexual, the idea that people are being, they're not representing a healthy form of their gender. It's a form of sexually attacking people for not politically conforming to your metrics of standards that you are going to bully them into accepting as an orthodoxy, and the idea that orthodoxy is the way to fix the world and make it a better place, that people, if they each conform to that categorization better and they follow the rules of the field marshal that gets to pervade over that category, that somehow there's this kind of collective wisdom that needs to be policed through culture. You have this kind of totalitarian-esque vision of a kind of And this is exactly the kind of intellectual murkiness and poison which provides a mafia type culture, a mafia type state, and a mafia type politics, because then the oligarchs can do whatever they want, because all they have to do is virtue signal. This is why big companies love identity politics, because it's so superficial, it's so easy to look like, because they can also do it better than anyone else, because big companies can waste money like no one else, because they have a big bureaucracy, and bureaucracies love superficial rules because it's the only thing that they can get right. The effectiveness not so good, but superficial moral standards, they're a pro at it. And so in this kind of arena, small businesses are being impacted doubly so, because they're being forced to contend against rules that can be prejudiced against them, because as companies they give less to the superficial ornamentation of the virtue signaling. That they can afford to get into this kind of extravagance and decadence and superficial morality. They have less capacity to essentially virtue signal. And so, you end up with a system that's fundamentally trying to give people some kind of societal reward, some kind of government benefits also, like government mandated things that facilitate and promote and benefit and give points to people that play the game. And so you end up with a fundamentally corrupt system in which it's all based around essentially political tokenism. And if you're going to have so much tokenism in your system, then you might as well give the token thing to someone who's politically connected. You might as well do it to someone who is part of the elite, essentially. So, the elite can play this game to try to capture more of middle management, while the whole system degrades itself and destabilizes and loses meritocracy and institutional value of common standards and common, so you can't have a common culture. You end up balkanizing into an identitarian sort of thing which can be ruled over and by a disguised oligarchy. It's the perfect veil to disguise an oligarchy. And it's the perfect kind of policy in South Africa that's used to essentially legalize corruption, because, well, you have to have a certain amount of black ownership. So it doesn't matter if it's many black people or if it's one politically connected black person. Black ownership is black ownership. And so, you have this huge thing to make a few people rich, and then everyone else has to suffer in an economy that can't grow, and that is fundamentally sabotaged to help the identity out. So everyone lives in a more depressing, ungrowing situation where there's no opportunity, and there's no growth of opportunity to support a cannibalistic system to fuel people's fight between the identities about redistributing identitarian pride instead of helping the most people that need development and that could actually profit or benefit from a society that actually has growing opportunity. Anyway, so that's juxtaposing some of those issues onto South African context, which is almost like the worst example of identity politics. I was even thinking of some really good rhetoric, like I think a politician should open this can of worms and say even things that are inflammatory. They should say things like, Julius Malema supports apartheid, was a huge supporter of apartheid. He just wished that his group orchestrated it first, or he just, rhetoric like that, I think would actually be, because I think that it would exactly ideologically cast the kind of double standard and the kind of racialist venom that these people depend on in terms of it being promulgated by the media. And the only way to shatter that very superficial edifice of reasonableness in their scapegoating and their generalization where, where they're always talking about blackness, whereas they're completely blind to all the black elites that get to profit from complaining about the plight of blackness instead of, it's a complete miss target of the problem. And they do this because it is the ideology of corruption. It facilitates corruption. This is why they have big houses. This is how they're able to maintain such wealth in the political elite, in the political classes. This is how they got all the money when through government power, because this is how it functions. Anyway, I mean, how many tractors have the EFF given to the how many farms have they donated the same tractor to, and they get away with it? Because no one cares about the detail when you're fighting for a generalization, which includes the elite and the politically connected. How convenient can you be making a polemic around race in the New South Africa while facilitating a kleptocracy and keeping the ideological blood flow of the money to facilitate your devastating cannibalism. Anyway.